All right, it is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and therefore the occasion to say good afternoon or good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to this edition, that is poor timing, of PONLive from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I am the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation. And as many of our regular viewers know, for 40 years now, the Program on Negotiation has led the world in research, executive education, and curriculum development related to the fields of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And today we have a very exciting topic for folks who care about negotiation, who care about labor, who care about what is going on in the US at this time. And we couldn't have picked better timing for this discussion on hot labor summer or hot labor fall or hot labor 2023, whatever you would like to call it. And today we're very pleased to be joined by Sharon Block, who is a professor of practice and the executive director of the Center for Labor and a Just Economy here at Harvard Law School. Prior to this, she served as the acting administrator in the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in Joe Biden's White House. She has also worked for the Obama administration and a variety of other institutions and organizations, including the National Labor Relations Board. So we are very excited to have Sharon Block with us today. Before I hand her the Zoom floor, just one note, I would like, as ever, to thank the incredible PON staff who does so much work getting these events ready. So that is Diane Long, of course, our events coordinator, James Kerwin, PON's assistant director, and Billy Fairfield. A big thanks to them. They will be working to get the recording of this session up on our website in just a couple of days. So if you have to duck out early or you want to share with a friend, you will be able to view it on our site. Professor Block is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a question and answer session at the conclusion of this. So if you have a comment, as ever, we love to see where you're coming in from all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you have a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen so that we may synthesize questions from others and get your question to Professor Block. So without further ado, I will hand over the Zoom floor. Sharon Block, thank you so much. Such an exciting moment to have you here with us at PON.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm really excited to be here with everybody. I'm excited to see how many people are here from all over the world. I often, when I meet people from other parts of the world, they have find U.S. labor law and our labor movement somewhat mysterious. So hopefully we can shed some light on that today. So the topic of my talk is hot labor summer, which, as Nicole noted, is now spreading into hot labor autumn, and I hope into the rest of 2023, where we are and how we got here. And I'll just give a little preview of sort of where are we now? We are in uncharted territory for the U.S. labor movement. I've been doing this a long time. I don't want to say exactly how long. And this is a time unlike any I have ever seen in terms of the just incredible volume of activity. And in addition, the breadth of activity in different sectors in the country, in different kinds of industries, in different kinds of workers. And so it's really is just an exciting time. But to really understand where we are now, we need to go back a little bit and see how we got here. So next slide. We're going to start way back with the earliest American strikes, because we're going to look at, there's really two different trends that define this period, this incredible period in U.S. labor activity. One is about strikes and the other is about new organizing. And so I just thought it was interesting to see that the first American strikes, of course, these predate the United States, but the first strikes here in what will become the United States start really in the Northeast, particularly in New England. Maine, you have fishermen who went on big strike in 1636, which also happens to be the year that Harvard was founded. And then in New York, the cartmen went on strike in 1677. We have a period, the next slide, of time when, in fact, for a couple of hundred years, for the most part, labor activity was unlawful in this country. We imported, as you probably know, British common law, which made workers getting together and trying to affect labor markets, affect prices, affect their terms and conditions of employment was actually unlawful. And so those are the conditions that prevailed for the next couple of hundred years. You then have in the beginning of the 1900s, the beginning of a labor movement that looks more like the labor movement that we have today. In fact, some of the unions that we have today actually started in this time period. But what really catalyzed the legal change that would define the labor movement up to today started with a big wave of strikes in the 1930s. In fact, from 1930, it's really hard to imagine. I mean, we think we're in a time of a lot of strikes right now, but from 1930 to 1941, there were 27,000 work stoppages in the United States, with a loss of 172 million workdays. So that's taking the number of people who were on strike and the number of days they were on strike and multiplying it. So that's really just an economy that's being almost constantly in churn because of all of the strike activity. So that's the backdrop for the big legal change in this area, which is the passage of the National Labor Relations Act in 1936, a key element of President Roosevelt's New Deal, the first time that there is a federally protected right to join a union, to go out on strike, to act collectively with your coworkers. You can't be fired for that. It sets up a process to sort of control and contain the process of growing the labor movement. Now, to be clear, you also had the right not to do any of that if you didn't want to. So that you see then at the beginning of 1936, as we have this federally protected right and this federal bureaucracy that comes together to create some guardrails around how that right plays out. A big increase in the number of workers joining unions. Of course, they could before that right was federally protected, but that was kind of a risky thing to do. So you see a tremendous number of workers flowing into the labor movement, starting to organize. You have this big wave of strikes then start to calm down as there's now an official sort of channel for this collective activity. This continues into the 1950s. In 1955, the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, those were sort of the two big federations of unions in this country, merge, which is important. One, because it creates a more powerful organization, both in terms of their influence on the economy, but also their influence in politics. At the same time that you have this merger and this big new political actor on the scene, you have union density. The percentage of workers in unions hits in 1954 hits its high point in American history, which is at that point about 35% of private sector workers are in unions in 1954. Shortly after this period, public workers in the public sector, people who work for the government, for especially state and local government, start to get the right to join unions also. And so we see just a strength and a size of the labor movement that had really never been on the scene in the US before. Next slide. This period, though, does not last very long. So we have from 1936 to about the 1960s, this big increase in the number of workers in unions. You can see in the graph on the right of the screen, this very, very steep climb up. But the seeds of the decline of that union density begin before the 1960s. So in 1947, again, the Congress intervenes. It's almost as if Congress said, we did this big thing in 1936. We gave workers this right to unionize. We did not know it was going to be quite this successful. And there's a sense of a little bit of a panic in the 1940s as the labor movement is growing and growing and growing. And so in 1947, you have legislation that kind of restrains the growth of the labor movement. The Taft-Hartley Act is considered anti-union legislation. It strengthens the rights of employers to oppose union organizing. It gives states the right to pass laws to restrain how workers can require dues payment from people who are represented by unions and covered by collective bargaining agreements. And you begin to see the effect of this legal change as in the 1960s, this decline in union density begins. Legal change is not the only explanation for this change. You also, I put up this quote here from George Meany, who is president of the AFL-CIO, the first president of the AFL-CIO, who's president for many, many years. And you see this, some of this, this decline in union density comes from sort of the labor movement itself taking its eye off the ball in terms of being committed to organizing more and more workers. There's more attention to sort of attending to the members they have, but sort of assuming that this strength and this density is going to continue. And of course, it doesn't, as you can see in this graph on the right. There's an attempt to sort of use the legal system again to sort of help rebuild the labor movement. In 1978, there was an attempt for sort of a pro-labor law reform. That legislation is filibustered. It's just interesting to think back on this. It's something that really doesn't, real filibusters don't actually happen in the US Senate anymore. But this bill, this labor law reform bill, was actually on the floor of the Senate, I think, for about 5 weeks. So it was a real filibuster, and it was a just a sort of an amazing duel between Senator Kennedy on one side, and it was really Senator Hatch on the other side who went at it for many, many weeks. Eventually, though, it becomes clear that the bill is not going to pass. It's pulled from the floor, and so you continue to have the same legal regime. Another really pivotal event in the history of the US labor movement is the PATCO strike in 1981. This is when President Reagan, the air traffic controllers, PATCO was the union of air traffic controllers, they went out on strike, even though the law denied them the right to strike as federal employees. They had, by statute, they had no right to strike. They believed that they had leverage, though, because obviously being able to be an air traffic controller is a pretty scarce skill. They decided to call President Reagan's bluff. They went out on strike. And those of you who were around then probably remember this event. This is one of those sort of events in the labor movement that actually broke through into popular history. President Reagan fired all of the air traffic controllers who went on strike, banned them from ever holding a job in the federal government again, and really signaled to employers across the economy that taking this kind of action against unions was okay. And you begin to see, even in the private sector, a real shift in the quality of the relationship between labor and management after the events of the PATCO strike. A much more, I think a lot of people see this as sort of the pivot point in a much more contentious relationship between employers and unions, and a more politicized relationship also, starting in 1981 in PATCO. The last really pivotal event that I'll mention just quickly is in 2018, the US Supreme Court, in a case called AFSCME versus Janus, strikes a blow to the way that unions are funded. It says the court says in all public sector unions, they cannot require their members or the workers who are covered by collective bargaining agreements cannot be required to pay for the services that unions provide to them. And so this essentially, if you know the term right to work, this essentially makes all public sector unionism right to work, and really strikes a blow at the revenue model, the ability of unions to raise funds to support their activities. Next slide. So what did this do to the economy? You can trace here, the bottom graph is union density. The top is an indication of income inequality. That's the share of income going to the top 10% of wage earners in the United States. You can see at this time where we talked about union density being at its highest in the 1950s into the early 1960s. Some economists call this period the Great Compression. It's historically, at least in modern history, the lowest level of income inequality that we've had in our country. And then you see this like inverse relationship between the health of the labor movement and income inequality in our country. As the labor movement declines over the recent decades, you see income inequality grow and grow. Next slide. Okay, so where are we now? That brings us to this really remarkable moment where we had, for most of my career, it's almost like can be a little depressing having to always talk about like what's going on in the labor movement, because as you could see from all those graphs, there's just had been this decades-long decline. So the first trend that I flagged that we're looking at now is this growth in union organizing. This is not George Meany's labor movement. There is great attention to new organizing in new sectors. And some of this has been sort of characterized as the Starbucks effect. You've had this amazing explosion of organizing at Starbucks coffee places. So you can see in this graph, just there's almost no organizing starting in 2021. We now today have almost 400 Starbucks that have had union elections and at which the union has won. You now, I think they're up to over 9,000 Starbucks baristas have voted to have a union. It's really been just a remarkable trend that has really spread very, very quickly. And you can see on the table on the right, so Starbucks, lots of elections, that's really fueled an increase in filings at the National Labor Relations Board, the agency that oversees union elections. But it isn't just Starbucks. It's been contagious. And we've seen organizing in a lot of new companies and new sectors. Next slide. So then the other trend that we're going to talk about is strike activity. On the graph, these are not exactly apples to apples ways of describing strike activity, but I think the comparison makes a point that's easy to understand. So on the left, you see over the long trend of history, where we are in terms of the number of strikes in this country. So in the 40s, 50s, you see even at the low point, a fairly high number of strikes, not 27,000 like we talked about in the years before the National Labor Relations Act passed, but still a fair number of strikes, going up at sometimes to almost 500 strikes in a particular year. Then as the labor movement gets weaker and weaker, you see that trend of strikes really starting to dissipate. So starting in like the 1980s, you have very, very few. These are strikes that involve large numbers of people, and they become almost rare events. On the right, though, you see more recently, and this, I think, really demonstrates what is happening in hot labor summer, this incredible spike in strike activity. So you've got now in 2023, already this year, 4.1 million and this is as of August, so this isn't even the UAW strike, 4.1 million workdays lost to labor stoppages. It's really, you can see a period of time that's unlike anything we've seen in a very long time. If you're wondering what that spike was in 2000, that's mostly attributable to a Verizon strike. It was a lot of people, Verizon workers, I think it was mostly across like the Northeast and into the South. A lot of workers who were out, and they were out for a long time. So that's a little bit of an anomaly, and you can see we are in the midst of an even greater anomalous period of strike activity. I'll also note that the UPS workers, the Teamsters at UPS didn't go out on strike. So they're not included in that, but I think in understanding what's been happening in the labor movement, we sort of put them in this trend also because they made a very credible threat to strike, which then they negotiated out of with the company. That would have been 350,000 workers. So you can see, even if they had only been out for a short time, that spike for hot labor summer would have been even greater. Next slide. So the other background fact to understand what's been happening over the last 6 months, year, and where we might be going from here is to see this trend in support among the public for labor unions. So if you look again back to around the time when the National Labor Relations Act first passed, and we had that explosion of workers joining unions, you have relatively high support for the labor movement, up to about 75%. That coincides with the period of time when there were more workers in unions than ever before. So it makes sense, right, that support for unions was very high during that time. Then again, you see this convergence as the health of the labor movement, the strength of the labor movement starts to dissipate. You see that public support decline in the same manner. Then we've got this steep drop that's happened coming out of the Great Recession. Most people, I think that this was a reaction to what some people call the bailout of the auto industry at that time. But since 2009, 2010, we've seen now this steep increase in support for labor unions. So this reflects just the answer to the question, do you approve or disapprove of labor unions? But we also see this trend in surveys where the public is asked, if you could be in a union, would you want to be? And more than 50% of Americans now answer that question positively. And again, that is a big increase over the past couple of decades. Next slide. Okay, so now that brings us up to hot labor summer and continuing into the fall. Next slide. So again, we come back to this first trend, new organizing. Where are we seeing this new organizing? We're seeing it in sectors where we've never really seen organizing before. The picture on the left, the man in red, is Christian Smalls. He's the president of the Amazon Labor Union. They successfully organized a warehouse in Staten Island, the first part of Amazon that had been organized in the United States. We also see Starbucks, Trader Joe's, lots of organizing in retail. You might have heard about REI also has had a number of union elections, Apple stores. Again, places where we've never had organizing, we've never really seen organizing before. And then higher education. You might have noticed, those of you who are on campus, we actually had a union election here last week among undergraduates, but a lot of organizing on university campuses. MIT Graduate Student Union, actually one of the biggest new collective bargaining units in the country just this year. Next slide. So what can we take away from this trend, from the trend of new organizing? One thing that's really interesting about this trend is a number of these organizing campaigns have been led by what we call independent unions. That is, unions that are not affiliated with the AFL-CIO or Service Employees International Union, which are the two sort of big federations of unions in this country, at least for private sector. These are unions that are specific to their workplaces. So the Amazon Labor Union is not part of any bigger organization. It exists just to organize Amazon warehouse workers. Another trend we see is that these are young workers. Imagine the average age of a Starbucks barista or somebody who works, a Apple Store genius. And even in the Amazon warehouses, those tend to be younger workers than we see in much of the rest of the labor movement. And again, as I've mentioned several times, these are new sectors where we hadn't seen organizing before. So what can we take away from all this organizing? It's a tremendous amount of energy. It's really exciting to see young people interested in the labor movement, taking a risk, going out and organizing. But I'm just going to be realistic here for a minute. This is not a happy story for the labor movement, though, completely. So again, it's great to see lots of organizing. The problem is now that we're like a year or so into these organizing campaigns, unfortunately, they are not yielding collective bargaining agreements. So there is not a single collective bargaining agreement covering any of the almost 400 stores, Starbucks stores, where workers have chosen to be represented by a union. In fact, the company has been accused of just refusing to bargain. They don't show up at bargaining sessions. They show up, they leave 5 or 10 minutes later. And so there are no collective bargaining agreements. There's no collective bargaining agreement at Amazon, despite the fact that they won that election, I think almost 2 years ago now. We've seen a level of response from the companies, especially at Starbucks, that I have seen a lot of union busting in my career. What is happening at Starbucks, I will say, goes beyond anything that I have seen before. There have been findings by the National Labor Relations Board, General Counsel, by administrative law judges at the NLRB, by the board itself, by judges at different levels, of just hundreds of violations of the National Labor Relations Act by Starbucks to try to quell this organizing campaign. And this takes tremendous resources for the unions to maintain these campaigns in the face of this anti-union activity during the campaign, and then to try to sustain support for the union when they can't get a collective bargaining agreement. Workers put their livelihoods on the line to organize a union, to vote for the union. And when there's no tangible result in the form of a collective bargaining agreement that improves their terms and conditions of employment, it's very difficult for the union to maintain that level of support. And my very firm belief is that this is a reflection of the fact that we really have a failed labor law in this country, at least as it applies to new organizing and trying to get a first contract. There's very little in the law that compels employers to actually sit at the bargaining table and to reach an agreement. The penalties for not doing so are almost non-existent, and we're really seeing that play out now in this trend of new organizing. Next slide. So here's the happier story for the labor movement, which is our second trend, which are really big strikes, as we've been talking about. We have the UAW strike, which just ended in the past week. As I talked about, we had the UPS Teamsters at UPS, which averted a strike, but brought a very credible threat of striking to the table. We have the Writers Guild, which went out on strike and was able to settle, although the actors, SAG-AFTRA, are still out on strike. That's been a very long strike. And then we had Kaiser workers, mostly in California, but there were actually Kaiser healthcare workers all over the country who went out on strike. That was a 3-day strike. I think about 70,000 workers, and they were able to settle that strike on very favorable terms. Next slide. So what can we take away from these big strikes? One thing, in contrast to the first trend of organizing, these are strikes that are happening not among workers recently organized. These are strikes that are happening within very mature collective bargaining relationships. The UAW and the big three auto companies have been negotiating collective bargaining agreements for about 100 years. So these are very established relationships. Another trend is that they are resulting in really big wins for workers. And in a second, we'll talk specifically about the UAW contract, but we saw huge wage increases for Teamsters at UPS. Kaiser workers also got big wage increases and a lot of innovative provisions in their contract that they really wanted. The writers also very favorable contract, especially in contrast to their previous contract. I think another really interesting trend is that these strikes are happening in sectors largely that are in big transition. So again, the auto workers, a great example of that. You have an industry that's been around for 100 years, but is making this big move to electric vehicles. Now they're still making cars, but making electric vehicles are very different from like what the jobs look like than putting together an internal combustion engine car. And so you have this like intensity around this round of collective bargaining because the workers want to have more security, want to have more security about what that future looks like. Same thing with the Writers Guild. You see in their contract provisions giving them a voice in how artificial intelligence is going to be used in the entertainment sector. And then also lurking in these big strikes is the impact of the pandemic. I think it's going to take more to really understand what that is, but there is a sense of workers having just been activated by that experience of what they went through during the pandemic and have wanting to have more of a say in their experience of work going forward. Next slide. So just quickly, if you haven't had a chance to read about the UAW contracts, these are sort of the highlights of the provisions. You have huge wage increases, 25% for permanent employees, 150% over the course of the contract increase for temporary employees. In part, that's because there essentially aren't going to be temporary employees anymore. All workers are going to be treated in the same way. And as a hedge against inflation, you have the return of cost of living allowance provisions. There's a lot in this very interesting provisions that protect jobs, that gave the union a say in sort of the direction of these companies. They got agreements to either keep open or reopen plants that had already been closed, and the right to strike over future decisions to close plants. I've never seen a provision like that before. It's very, very interesting and clearly important to the union about, again, having a say in the future of this industry as it's going through big changes. Big foothold in the electric vehicle future through provisions that will allow the union to represent or have an easier pathway to representing workers who are going to be in the battery manufacturing plants and in new plants that the companies are going to open to put together electric vehicles. And then I think for people who are interested in negotiations, there are some very interesting provisions that are really about the union's tactics. So this is a 4.5-year collective bargaining agreement. Usually collective bargaining agreements are 3 years. It's because the law gives special protection to unions during the first 3 years of a collective bargaining agreement. So that's just become the norm. I think the UAW wanted a slightly longer contract for a couple of reasons. One, because they want the contract in place while they work on organizing workers in non-union plants. So think Tesla and the transplants, the foreign car companies that are operating in the United States. They don't want to have to do both at the same time of like negotiating and hanging on to these big wins that they have in this contract. They want to go in and organize those new workers while they've got these big wins on the books. They've also asked for a May Day expiration date for this contract, and this is part of a movement across the labor movement to get lots of unions to have this same expiration date so that it gives them more leverage sort of across the economy if there's the potential for a lot of big strikes at the same time when these collective bargaining agreements expire. Next slide. And so again, just some of the takeaways from the UAW experience, this really positions the UAW to be able to say once again that having a job in the auto industry equals having a good middle class job. These are jobs for people, for the most part, who don't have to have a college degree, which by the end of this contract will pay with overtime. The estimates are like $85,000 to $100,000 a year. It means you can work in an auto factory and you can buy a house. You can put kids through college. You can even take a vacation every once in a while. It's been a while since the UAW has been able to say that to its members or to workers that they want to organize. And that's really key. Again, it gives them that having this really positive contract, they are hoping at least will give them leverage to organize other auto companies. I think Shawn Fain has said, the president of the UAW, that they are already engaged in trying to organize workers at Tesla plants. And then I think that this contract really, this whole strike and contract experience gives tremendous inspiration for the labor movement. Shawn Fain, the president, is a new leader. He's the first leader of the UAW to be directly elected by the members. He took a really bold strike strategy and it seems to have worked. He made really bold demands and it worked. It was bold leadership in terms of him putting himself on the line. He was on social media, he was on the news every day, speaking directly to workers, using very colorful language often. And he had a bold vision for the future, and that worked. I mean, he really put a marker down that he wanted a return to good middle-class jobs, and he wants that to be part of the electric vehicle future. And so, he kind of came out of nowhere, but I think that people who are going to study the labor movement and labor negotiations for a long time are going to be studying this strike and Shawn Fain's leadership. Next slide. So my advice for companies is to reject the binary. You don't have to be Starbucks. It's not, in my opinion, it is really not a great strategy to approach your unions from such a hostile sort of union busting perspective, but that doesn't mean that you have to be Ben and Jerry's and that you have to welcome the union into your workplace with open arms. There is another way. Next slide. Microsoft is, and I just want to preface this by saying that in the past, I have done some consulting for Microsoft on labor issues. So take what I'm going to say maybe with a grain of salt, but Microsoft has really forged a different path with the Blizzard Activision employees that they're bringing into the company now that that transaction has been approved. They are giving the union space to talk to workers, to have this really be a conversation between the union and these workers in the gaming industry. It's really not a lot of other companies that have taken this approach. They're not telling their workers that they're pro-union, but they're also not telling their workers that they are anti-union. And we'll see what happens, but there have been some wins for unions already in the gaming industry. So it's a really interesting approach. And the last slide, contact information. Feel free to reach out anytime and happy to take some questions now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sharon. This has been a really inspiring discussion. We have tons of questions in the Q&A. As ever, we are not going to be able to get to all of them, but we have a number that are kind of centered around the reverberations that could happen from some of these massive gains that have been made. So, and I know, the UAW is like 2 days old, so you may not be able to give prognostics on what that's going to look like, but bold gains, 25% in wage increases. Do we think that this might, lead to aftershocks in other sectors or folks who are currently thinking about negotiating or going on strike?
I mean, I will tell you, the UAW certainly hopes so. I mean, again, first, immediately, they hope that there will be aftershocks throughout the non-union parts of the auto industry. So for a long time, the UAW has been trying to find a strategy to organize the transplants. So there have been campaigns at Mercedes, at Nissan, at Volkswagen. All those companies have located their factories in the South where union density is very, very low. None of those campaigns so far have been successful. I think Shawn Fain thinks that success is the best path to more success. And so really focused on getting these great contracts. And he can now go to those companies and to Tesla and say to workers there, wouldn't you like to have this too? But I also, like I said, I think this is going to be inspirational across the labor movement. I mean, there are some trends. We didn't talk too much about UPS. But that was also an incredibly strong contract. And one thing that's similar between the strategy at UPS and the strategy at the auto sector, with the UAW, is this narrative from the union that we made sacrifices when times were tough. They were now negotiating with companies that are doing really well. And so there was this narrative of like, it is time to share the success. So not just we deserve this, we don't care about what the health of the company is or what the dynamics in the market are. They're saying we are looking at the market. We see companies that you are doing well, and it is time to give back because we gave when you asked us to, when the market said that things weren't so good.
Well, and piggybacking off of that narrative, and I'm going to paraphrase questions from Michael, Nancy, and Joyce at various points in the chat and in the Q&A, how much do these kinds of significant gains really affect these companies? So, things were obviously the big three auto companies were in a very prestigious position to be able to give demands. How hurting are they now? And, how affected were they by the time that these teams were on strike?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the auto industry, but the number that you hear over and over again is that labor costs now are only about 5% of the cost of producing a car. So some people think back to, again, just not that long ago when the US auto industry was not doing very well, and there was a lot of experts who said this had to do with labor costs and with union contracts that were unaffordable. The auto industry is in a really different place now. Some of those costs that got them into trouble had to do with costs related to retirees. There was a lot of restructuring over how the companies and the unions dealt with those costs. So that's not a part of this anymore. And I think very consciously, the car companies have sort of changed how they do business so that these labor costs are much less. I don't think anybody expects as a result of these contracts for that 5% number to really change all that much. Yeah, I mean, the companies undoubtedly lost some money during the strike. I think a 6-week strike, though, is something, and again, it wasn't everything. These were targeted strikes, different parts of different companies at different times. That's part of the innovation that Shawn Fain brought to this. I'm not hearing a lot of speculation that this is really going to hurt these companies. These are savvy business people. They've got their eye on this EV future. And I think there's a lot of hope that these will be costs that they can build into their business models and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Shifting away from auto, and we have lots of questions in the Q&A about different sectors of the economy and your take on that. But one from Ariane, who's at the Colorado Labor Relations Unit, and is asking about public sector organizing. And she says that in Colorado, we've seen an increase in new legislation over the past years addressing workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain in the public sector. She's wondering if this is a national trend and if you can speak to any research about that.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. And the public sector is really, really important. It's a very important part of the labor movement. That again, as I talked about, as a result of the AFSCME versus Janus decision, life has gotten a lot harder for public sector unions to be able to just cover their expenses, because like I said, the Supreme Court said that you cannot make employees who are covered by collective bargaining agreements, those people that you provide services for, you cannot require them to pay for the services that the union provides. So it's a tough time for public sector unions. And I think a lot of people don't realize that there are still workers. There's a number of states that do not allow public sector workers to unionize. And so I think there is renewed attention to those places to try to move legislation in those states to give those workers for the first time the right to collective bargaining. I mean, some of us think about the right to collective bargaining as a human right. It is in, UN treaties on human rights, yet we deny that right to a number of workers in public sector jobs around the country. There is also, continued effort to pass a right to collective bargaining for public sector workers in Congress. I couldn't with a straight face tell you that I'm optimistic that that will pass. I mean, we just came off a period where for 3 weeks, we didn't even have a functioning Congress. And obviously with a divided Congress, the idea of passing new collective bargaining rights at the federal level seems rather remote, but I think there are people who care a lot about this and are continuing to press for it. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. You touched on education, and this is something that is close to home for all of us who work, obviously here at Harvard. You mentioned organizing, at both the sort of student level, at the staff level, our colleagues at MIT down the road. Can you touch on, some of the trends there? We have someone from the California State University system talking about, how inflation has been such a strain on educators there. We have someone from Florida in K-12 education asking questions about that. So could you speak to those trends, and if you anticipate that there will be any larger kind of movements across the country or on a statewide basis on the education sectors?
Yeah, again, thanks for that question. Again, so much to talk about in labor. I didn't even get to big strikes in higher education that got some big wins for union members on university campuses. So in the University of California system, there was a big strike earlier this year. At Rutgers, there was also a big strike on that campus, on that system, which yielded big wins for workers. So you are seeing these same trends reflected in higher education. So some in the state systems, but also I think what has surprised people is to see how much this trend is also playing out at private institutions. Again, we talk about MIT. There's just been a lot of organizing on campuses, not just graduate students, but also among staff. But the graduate student organizing has really taken off. That is, again, another place where the law intersects with these bargaining trends. The National Labor Relations Board has gone back and forth on whether graduate students actually have the right to be in unions or not. We've now had a number of years where the law has sort of settled down a little bit. There was an expectation that Trump NLRB had said they were going to reverse the law and take that right away, but they just didn't get around to it. And so I think that has allowed a lot more organizing around graduate students to mature and to get collective bargaining agreements. And I hope for university administrators to see that campuses can actually function, that some of the hysteria sort of on both sides around this issue, now we have experience with it and we see these universities are continuing to operate. It's another trend Diane didn't mention, but that we're also seeing is organizing among physicians at university hospitals. And that is also new. We don't have a lot of physician organizing, but that's another trend that's sort of popping up. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah, really interesting. Thank you so much. We have a question from Allison asking, are these trends going to affect at-will employment? Do you think that there will be some shifts, given the gains that we have seen?
Really interesting question. So again, thank you for that. I mean, obviously the best way out of being an at-will employee is to have a union. So for folks who don't know, at-will is a term of art. It is the predominant mode of employment in the United States, which means that if you're not in a union, probably you're an at-will employee and you can be fired for a good reason, a bad reason, no reason, as long as it's not an unlawful reason. And the unlawful reasons are, think like anti-discrimination. So you can't be fired because of your race, your gender, disability, that basket of reasons. Other than that, for most people in the United States, your boss can walk in and say, you know what, you're wearing a purple tie today. I hate purple ties. You're fired. Or your boss can even walk in and say, you know what, I'm not even going to give you a reason. You're fired. And there's nothing, you have no right to contest that. So generally, I think almost universally, workers who are covered by a collective bargaining agreement, in that collective bargaining agreement will be a provision that says that you can only be fired for just cause. So again, the most common way out of at-will employment is to be represented by a union and have that just cause protection. A new trend we are seeing, though, very nascent, but it's there, are statutory, at the state and local level, statutory just cause provisions. So saying for non-union workers, say in New York City now, in the fast food sector, non-union employees are no longer at will. They can only be fired for just cause as the result of legislation passed by the New York City Council. There's a parking lot attendants in Philadelphia also covered by a just cause provision. So we're starting to see some efforts to change that just will default for non-union workers.
Yeah, great. I'm very curious to hear, you showed the history of union organizing and public sentiment and approval. What do you think will happen, in the wake of hot labor summer and fall? Do you anticipate that there will continue to be strong support? Is it, could there be a backlash? What should we be thinking about how the public will see this, especially in an era that still continues to be inflationary and with uncertainty about the economy?
Yeah, this is just my intuition, is that we will see that number even grow. Because again, I think that the leaders in these big strikes have been very conscious of framing what is at stake. Again, talking about these strikes that have been in sectors where there's a lot of uncertainty about the future, I think a lot of workers feel that uncertainty about the future. Is a robot going to come and take my job away? Is my employer going to put Big Brother cameras in and use AI to monitor my every movement? And so I think people are going to respond to seeing unions help give workers a voice in what the future is going to look like. So I think they're going to respond really positively to that. I think there's also been so much more attention to a basic fairness argument, this idea of Shawn Fain saying, you know what? We sacrifice when times are bad. We want to share when times are good. I think a lot of workers feel left behind, even as shareholders. There's in the UAW strikes, there was talk about how the number of stock buybacks that have happened over the past few years, CEO pay. I think all of this framing really resonates with people. And so I think we're going to continue to see high levels of support. And we know that during the strikes, there was a lot of surveys about how workers felt, how the public felt about the two sides in the strike. And there was really very, very high levels of support for the UAW strikers, for the Writers Guild, and for the Teamsters had they decided to go out on strike.
Absolutely. And we have questions and comments related to how this is going to play out in the campaign for the presidency. Obviously, we saw our first president on a picket line, this year with President Biden, and also former President Trump, making a play for union support against electric vehicles and all of that. So what do you continue to anticipate will happen at this singular moment in the US as we look towards the election?
Yeah, so again, I will preface this by saying I used to work for President Biden, so again, take my opinion.
Have a unique opinion, yeah.
For what it's worth. I thought it was a remarkable thing that he went and literally stood with workers on a picket line. This is a president who has said that he wants to be thought of as the most pro-union president in history, and he put his feet where his mouth is. And I think that really resonates with people. It's not just a slogan for him. He showed up. I think Joe Biden is in the enviable position of his genuine policy preferences align with good politics. Now, I'm not a political person, I'm a policy person, but it's not just showing up on a picket line. His administration has really taken seriously using the policy levers that they have to support working people, to support the labor movement. And I think that's what he believes in. This was my experience working for him. That's what he genuinely believes in, as the right policy for working people, for our economy writ large. I hope I will say, I hope it's okay for me to say that's also good politics. There are just a lot of working people out there who want to feel like the economy works for them. And I think that's what he's showing, and that's what he was trying to communicate. The other really important thing, getting back to the UAW strike, is sort of the most important thing, it seems like, to Joe Biden's administration, is to support and grow the middle class and to address the climate crisis. And there being even a perception of a conflict between the interests of working people and what we need to do to tackle the climate crisis is a problem for both of those priorities. The UAW has done in these contracts is to show that there isn't a conflict, that you can do both. And so I think that is going to be a very, very important dynamic for the rest of the president's administration, but also for his campaign.
That's great. I'm going to apologize to everyone in the Q&A for whom I am not able to get to your questions. We could spend an hour talking about the difference between the U.S. labor situation and that abroad. There are questions related to that. So I'll ask one last from Adam. Do you anticipate that multi-employer bargaining situations might become more common now, in particular private sector industries?
So, Adam, I would hope so, but unfortunately, our law makes that very difficult. It's another aspect of how broken the U.S. labor law is. Much of the rest of the world, that's how bargaining is done. It's a system called sectoral bargaining, where you have employers within the same industry bargain together with unions representing all of the workers in that industry, and it creates a much more sort of predictable and rational approach to the economy. Unfortunately, our labor law just makes that very, very difficult. And so I wish I could be more optimistic. Again, that it happens in the auto industry as a result of patterns that were set a very long time ago, but it's very difficult to sort of create that pattern now. So a lot of my work is around thinking about what labor law reform should look like. What would a labor law that would actually empower workers in the economy and democracy? What would the provisions of that kind of labor law be? And this approach, like the sectoral bargaining approach, is a key part of what we've been advocating for.
All right. Thank you so much, Sharon Block. This was a very informative hour. We really appreciate you giving your time to explain this to us. I mean, the negotiations community has been following all of this, with great interest, and it is really wonderful having your expertise. Everyone, thank you for joining from all over the world. We appreciate your really good questions. And again, you have Sharon Block's contact information, which will be in the recording if you wanted to ask a question that we didn't get to, unfortunately. Just a note about what's happening next. So our next event next week will be on the dispute about art restitution, and specifically the Parthenon marbles. So that is a very interesting negotiation case, and we are looking forward to hearing from Alexander Herman and Nicholas O'Donnell. And then Kieran Doyle will be coming to speak to us at the end of the month on European Union peace building and peace efforts there. So looking forward to seeing you at that, perhaps at one of our classes live in person. We always have labor folks taking negotiation trainings with PON. We have had lots of groups from various sectors coming in, as well as, of course, lawyers and people from the corporate world and folks interested in conflict resolution generally. So a big thanks again to Sharon Block. Very special thanks to our fabulous PON staff, and to all of you for joining us today. We hope to see you at a future event very soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day.